Welcome to the administration and scoring training video for the Transactional Exchanges in Texting for Aphasia rating scale. I am Jamie Lee. I am from the University of Utah. I also want to introduce my co-PI on this project, Jamie Azios, our research SLP, Mary McMahon, Leora Cherney, who has been a consultant on this project and co-developed the original version of the texting transactional success measure with me, and Gerasimos Fergadiotis, who has provided stats consulting on this measure. I want to acknowledge our funding from NIH to support this project. A little bit of background on texting. We're all aware of how widespread and popular texting is worldwide. In the United States, 97% of Americans text daily. And we know that among healthy adults, electronic written communication like texting and IMing cultivates social connectedness. For people with aphasia, using technology like smartphones and texting has been identified as a priority. Texting has a number of advantages for people with aphasia and other communication difficulties. It's asynchronous or semi-synchronous, so texting offers more time to read, process, and formulate responses compared to face-to-face communication or phone calls. There are a number of features that are built in to most smartphones and cell phones that support texting for individuals with impaired lexical retrieval or difficulty with written expression. These features consist of predictive text, autocorrect, for example, and a variety of non-lexical tools to support writing like emojis and photographs. The prevalence of smartphone usage in the general population and the social nature of texting make this a very attractive communication mode for people with aphasia. We also believe there is a lot of rehab potential in focusing on texting for individuals with aphasia. In this model, this highlights the communication that's exchanged via texting, where we have increase in transaction, the exchange of information, and increased interaction with texting, that social nature of communication. Those elements lead to social connectedness and eventually to improved quality of life outcomes. Even though texting is very popular and is a very appropriate rehab target, there were no measures of texting for people with aphasia. So we looked at developing a measure of texting transactional success grounded in Brown and Yule's theory of transaction and interaction within communication. We wanted a measure that was very functional, that was not limited to capturing linguistic accuracy or spelling, as those are not important things in communication via texting. We wanted the measure to reflect the ability for people with aphasia to convey and exchange meaningful information via text. The Texta is a 0 to 2 rating scale of a person with aphasia's responses to a brief script delivered via text. Our initial measure had 3 turns. It was a 3-turn script, and it was shown to have excellent inter-rater reliability, acceptable internal consistency, and moderate to strong criterion validity based on scores between the Texta and the Western Aphasia Battery, AQ as a measure of overall aphasia severity, LQ, the language quotient, which looks at reading and writing, and the writing subscale. We are currently assessing the validity of an extended 6-turn script, which more closely resembles natural conversation via texting. Here we have some instructions for administering the text-to script. The SLP will want to confirm that both the clinician and the client's phones can send and receive text messages, either that Wi-Fi is accessible or self-service is turned on. We suggest that you arrange seating so that the SLP can see the client's screen and make observations about the features and tools that they use. We recommend video recording the client's screen during administration so that you can go back and look more closely at their responses. We suggest using a timer to note the time taken to complete the script and to complete each turn. Here are the instructions for administering the script. We explain to the client, we want to have a texting conversation. I'm going to send a few text messages. We want you to read the message and respond as best as you can because this is a test. I can't give you any help, so just do your best. Use any of the resources you normally would when texting. I will tell you when we have completed the test. Are you ready? For the SLP, we suggest you need to deliver prompts one at a time. Don't leave your screen. Send the next prompt immediately after receiving the individual's response. You can add minimal continuers to your response, such as okay or sounds good, to mimic some authenticity or naturalness of the texting interaction. In our second prompt, we use nice, but you could use an alternative continuer. The administrator has some flexibility to change a question, a prompt, if the examinee asks a question, for example. How are you? You can answer that minimally, and to change the prompt minimally to maintain the topic. So you will see some examples of that when we get to discussing scoring. Here you see the script prompts. What are you doing this weekend is the first prompt. For the second prompt, you may see, what about dinner? What kind of food should we have throughout the examples? We think that some sort of continuer to respond to their answer to the first prompt with let's make dinner plans, what kind of food should we have, is less ambiguous. You'll see the rest of the prompts listed out here. Note that prompts 4, 5, and 6 are our extended version, which offer comments and more open-ended prompts. Next, I want to dive into the scoring for the texta. So here's a snapshot of the texta ratings for successful transaction, which is a 2, partial transaction, which is a 1, and no successful transaction, which is a 0. For a score of 2, the response reflects comprehension of the prompt and conveys to the communication partner meaningful information related to the immediate prompt. Graphemic, morphological, grammatical errors that do not affect the meaning are all acceptable. It is also acceptable to have a self-correction. A couple of examples are provided here for you. In a 1, the response provides partial or incomplete information within the context of the prompt. There's a couple examples here for you. One of them is the response to when should we go? The respondent replies, nix. This may have been because they misunderstood the WH question when and answered where should we go with the name of a restaurant. For a 1, the communication partner will likely need to clarify because the response wasn't completely clear. For a score of 0, there is no successful transaction. The response does not convey any meaningful information within the context of the prompt. In the example, we see a repetition of a word from the prompt, when should we go? I go, but there's nothing meaningful that's conveyed in relation to the question, when should we go? What are you doing this weekend? We see a series of graphemes that the person responds with. So this is not a meaningful response and would receive a score of 0. So we're going to talk in more detail about a score of 2, successful transaction. It is okay if the participant has graphemic or spelling errors as long as the word is recognizable. Morphological and syntactical errors that do not affect the meaning are acceptable. Emojis and other non-lexical tools or symbols that reflect meaning are also acceptable. You do not have to have a response that is lexical. Successful self-corrections are also acceptable. Irrelevant or additional words or graphemes that do not change the meaning of their response are also acceptable. It is also a score of a 2 to have a response that promotes social connection or conveys affiliation. Here are some example responses that would yield a score of 2. It is okay if the person responds to, what are you doing this weekend? Nothing. That conveys the absence of plans. That is completely meaningful. In the next example, what about dinner? What kind of food should we have? They answer an attempt for spaghetti. It's meaningful despite the spelling error because the intended word is still recognizable and they're conveying meaning related to the prompt. They think we should go get spaghetti. In the next example, pizza-like, there's an additional word, like. It doesn't add meaning, but it also doesn't take away from the meaning of pizza. Another response that would receive a score of 2 is if the respondent inserted a link to a restaurant. They used a non-lexical tool to convey meaningful information, or perhaps an emoji of a taco or a bowl of soup. So non-lexical tools like links to restaurants, emojis, etc. can receive a score of 2. When should we go? Notice the response is Thursday. It's a perfectly acceptable day to have dinner plans. It doesn't have to be a weekend day. In this example, Thursday receives a 2. At 4:30, a time. That would be a reasonable response to yield a score of 2. Here we have examples of responses that yielded a 2 from the next 3 prompts. Great, I'm excited to see you. A simple emoji sent back that promotes social connection and affiliation would also yield a score of 2. Or see you. The response conveys agreement and is socially appropriate. Anything else going on? A response of nope. That conveys meaning in the context of the prompt, despite the lack of elaboration there. Here we see an example of fishing, so an emoji to respond to anything else going on. The emoji conveys meaning, activity around fishing. Oh, tell me more about that. Responses that could receive a 2, rest and relax. So despite lack of syntax, there is meaning there. We're just going to be resting and relaxing. Attaching a photo of a fish, that conveys meaning. It's giving more information about the topic. So those responses all yield a 2. Successful transaction. Next, we'll talk about responses that would receive a score of 1, partial transaction. The response provides partially meaningful or incomplete information within the context of the prompt. So we have several considerations. The response is one in which the communication partner, the person texting, may need to clarify. So the communication burden is shared with the communication partner. The response could reflect impaired comprehension of the prompt. Perhaps they answered a related question, like a different WH question. We saw that before with someone answering where should we go instead of when should we go. The response might convey temporally inaccurate information. So we're going to look at tense here to see if tense may add to some confusion and require clarification. If so, then that response would likely yield a score of 1. It's partially transactional, but we need some clarification. A response could include a request for clarification, like ask me that again, or I don't understand. And that is meaningful for someone with aphasia. It's partially transactional. Please kind of repeat your message. Continuing on with those scores of 1, some considerations are whether or not the response contains words or additional information that could alter the meaning or information. With a 2, an additional word that doesn't alter the meaning is still transactional. But if additional words add confusion, it could receive a score of 1. Another response that would receive a score of 1 gives some information that's incongruent given the context of the prompt. Maybe they list 2 different restaurants to what kind of food should we have. So we don't quite understand the message they're trying to convey. The response may have used predictive text inaccurately. If the respondent had an over-reliance on predictive text or autocorrect, it could create some problems within the response and may reflect an inability to self-monitor or repair. Here we have some examples of responses that would receive a score of 1 for partial transaction. What are you doing this weekend? Good weekend. That is partially informative, but there's not enough content for that to really receive a 2. In the next example, what are you doing this weekend? I saw a good movie. We have some temporal inaccuracy here. By responding in the past tense, it's a bit confusing whether or not they understood the question, what are you doing this weekend? So that would receive a 1 for that temporal inaccuracy or that tense issue. What about dinner? What kind of food should we have? Subway for dinner, Mexico. Here we have that issue of incongruence that the communication partner would need to clarify because we have kind of 2 incongruent responses, Subway and Mexican food. The partner would need to clarify. It would need another turn, so it gets a score of 1. What about dinner? What kind of food should we have? Yes. Well, it's meaningful. Maybe they want to have dinner, but it's only a partial response to this prompt. We had pizza. Again, there's that tense issue. Temporal inaccuracy based on the prompt, what kind of food should we have? Had they just responded pizza, then that could have received a score of 2. To the prompt, when should we go? I should be here by 9:20 a.m. Again, we have some temporal inaccuracy or inconsistency. 9:20 in the morning isn't a plausible time that they should be planning dinner. But it is informative. That would receive a 1. We've already discussed the issue of answering where to this WH when question. When should we go? Nix. That seems to reflect some impaired comprehension. They're answering probably the name of a restaurant. Let's go through some more examples. To the next few prompts. Great, I'm excited to see you. I'm excited for I. Ooh, So the response is partially meaningful. They're also excited, but those additional words that they've included in the response add some confusion. So that receives a score of 1 versus I'm excited might have gotten a score of 2. Here we see in the next example a response with the kind of mind-blown emoji. That's a meaningful emoji, but in the context of this prompt, it's incongruent with the prompt. I'm excited to see you doesn't really inspire a mind-blown emoji, so that would receive a 1. Anything else going on? The person with aphasia texted son. Well, that's partially informative. We know there's something related to his son that they're trying to convey. But again, the communication partner would need another turn to clarify what's going on with your son. Let's move on to, oh, tell me more about that. I don't know. I don't know in this context is partially meaningful, but the communication partner would need another turn to maybe restate their question. Oh, tell me more about that. That's all. The response provides partially meaningful information, but is incomplete. They may have had difficulty generating more content. It's not quite a 2, but it's not meaningful at all. It's not a 0, so a 1 is the best score for that's all. Next, I want to discuss scores of 0, no successful transaction. The response does not convey meaningful information within the context of the prompt. Some considerations here are that the response contains words, real words, or graphemes, letters, that are unrecognizable in the context of the prompt, perhaps a kind of neologistic written form. The response may repeat the prompt or part of the prompt without adding additional meaningful information. Let's look at some examples of scores that yielded a 0, of responses that yield a 0. What are you doing this weekend? Yes. Well, yes is meaningful in some context, but it's not meaningful relative to this prompt. What about dinner? What kind of food should we have? Here we have would to, there, to, should, to experience, kind of jargon, neologistic, some real words mixed in, but no meaning is conveyed. When should we go? Great. Well, great is a meaningful response, but not in the context of this prompt. Great, I'm excited to see you. The response is a series of numbers, 3, 4, 5. This may have reflected kind of an automatic production of hitting some numbers. This isn't a time because we don't necessarily see time indicated with a colon or a PM. So 3, 4, 5 is not meaningful in this context. The next one is a neologism, flumish. It's not a meaningful production. Anything else going on? On, it's a repetition of a word from the prompt, but it doesn't convey any meaning, so it's a 0. It's not that deeply. Well, here we have real words, but they don't carry meaning in the context of the prompt, and that's the real takeaway. The last example I want to talk about is, oh, tell me more about that. I-O. Well, we have an exclamation point, which we talked about a score of 2 conveys that social connectedness or social appropriateness, affiliation. Here they're expressing excitement with that exclamation point, but there's no content that's conveyed in addition to that excitement. So that would receive a score of 0. Next, we're going to work through some structured practice items where you'll have an opportunity to practice scoring some examples that are generated from actual participants with aphasia who have completed the texta, along with some artificial examples that we've generated for your practice. So in this example, we have, what are you doing this weekend? Home painting. Think about what you would score that. If you gave it a score of fully transactional, you are correct. Home painting conveys meaningful information. Nice, let's make dinner plans. What kind of food should we have? Mexico dinner with burritos. That's also a 2, meaningful. When should we go? The respondent wrote Los Mocha. What would you score Los Mocha? Likely the name of a restaurant. If you gave it a score of 1, you are correct. It is meaningful because it's connected to the content of the script so far, but it is partially transactional. It does not respond, it does not convey an answer to when should we go. I'm excited to see you. Me too. Fully transactional. Anything else going on? And we see here a football emoji, very meaningful. Score of 2. And we have a meaningful emoji. They're going to be doing something related to football. The next turn asks for an expansion of this information. Oh, tell me more about that. And they respond, Bears going to win. So we know they're going to be watching the Bears. Okay, what are you doing this weekend? The person with aphasia responds, we can Doug church. Doug is meaningful. It's a name. It has a capital. Church is a meaningful word. It's partially conveying information, but the communication partner would likely need another turn to clarify. Are you going to church with Doug? Are you going to Doug's church? So that would receive a 1. What about dinner? What kind of food should we have? We are doing STACK, stack. That is likely a paragraphia. They may have been going for steak, and it's a 1 because we have that error there, and there's some unclarity about what the target was. What kind of food should we have? And the communication partner might need to clarify steak. That sounds good. Spelling and graphemic errors are common writing problems for people with aphasia. We can think about other examples that might be recognizable, and then they would be a 2 versus a letter or 2 off. If they're unrecognizable and need some clarification, that would be a score of 1. What would you score this as the response? It's only 1 letter off, and so it's pretty recognizable that that's cheeseburgers, and that would be a 2 versus a 1. Let's keep going. When should we go? We are going to the movies. That would also be a score of 1 because the communication partner would need to clarify. Tense is another factor that adds confusion here. In this example, the individual responded in the present tense when the future tense was really indicated. When should we go? So this receives a 1 because of that tense issue, the temporal inaccuracy, and that another turn is needed to clarify when should we go. Should we go after the movies? I'm excited to see you! Exclamation, happy face emoji. The person responds with a thumbs up. That's very transactional. Anything else going on? We going to the game. We have a syntactical error, but still very meaningful. It receives a score of 2. Oh, tell me more about that. The person responds son. Here we have some content conveyed, but we don't know enough based on this response to have a fully transactional response. What about your son? It would need another turn. Your son's playing a game, for example. So when you're considering whether or not you're giving a 1, you're really asking yourself, would this response require another turn to clarify and get more information? What are you doing this weekend? May go race on Speedway. Meaningful in response to the prompt. That receives a score of 2. Cool. Look, the examiner has used a different continuer instead of nice. What about dinner? What kind of food should we have? Sure, period, turkey, period. They've responded to both questions, and that is meaningful. It receives a score of 2. Turkey may be a little bit unusual of a response, but it's still appropriate and meaningful in response to that prompt. When should we go? The person responds with 6:00. Is that reflective of a time? Is that meaningful? We would say yes. Even though it's missing the colon, we don't need that to know that it's a time. I'm excited to see you. Smiley face. Here we see the person with aphasia respond with a reaction, a heart reaction, meaning they like that. That's meaningful. It would be a 2. Reaction conveys meaning. Anything else going on? The person responds headache. That is very meaningful. That receives a 2. Here in this response, the next prompt, instead of saying, oh, tell me more about that, we add something meaningful to keep the authenticity of the script. Sorry, tell me more about that. And the person responds, too much stress. Even though 2 is misspelled, that is meaningful and would receive a score of 2. This next example, what are you doing this weekend? Here we see a response that doesn't convey information. It has a recognizable word, but it's not meaningful. So that receives a score of 0. Nice, let's make dinner plans. What kind of food should we have? Again, we see some real words that are recognizable, and we see food is relevant to the prompt, but it doesn't convey any meaning. So that also receives a score of 0. When should we go? We see a number, so they may have been attempting to write a time. That is partially meaningful, and we could clarify. Do you mean 12 o'clock? Do you mean noon? So that would receive a score of 1. I'm excited to see you. M2. Well, we know what the target probably is there. I bet they were going for me too. So that is a meaningful response relative to that prompt. That would receive a score of 2. Anything else going on? Again, we have some real words and they're recognizable, but they're not meaningful in conveying anything else going on with them. So that receives a score of 0. Oh, tell me more about that. Again, nothing meaningful is conveyed in those words responded. That's a 0. What are you doing this weekend? Is to call for about. Here we have some recognizable words, but are they transactional? Is their meaning conveyed? If you gave this a 0, you are correct. What about dinner? What kind of food should we have? The person with aphasia responds milk, eggs, and bread. There is some meaningful content conveyed, but is it completely transactional in the context of this prompt that's asking about dinner plans? If you gave it a 1, you are correct. What kind of list does this look like? It almost looks like a grocery list that the person with aphasia recognized food in the prompt, but didn't quite comprehend that it was about dinner plans. When should we go? The response is no. Is that meaningful in the context of the prompt? No. So that would receive a score of 0. We can look at this response as something that might have been automatic. No might be an automatic response that is preserved in someone with more severe aphasia or more severe writing problems. So no is not transactional in that context. I'm excited to see you. We have words, but are they meaningful in the context of the prompt? If you gave that a 0, you're correct. Anything else going on? Get more. We have real words, but again, they're not conveying meaningful information relative to this request for more information. So that's a 0. Tell me more about that. We have store and an angry face emoji. Here we have some content conveyed, but it's not fully clear. It's partially meaningful. Maybe they don't like going to the store. So that would receive a score of 1. The communication partner could text another turn. Oh, you're going to the store? You don't like going to the store? And that would give them some content to then have another turn to clarify. So that's a 1. Here's our last practice item. What are you doing this weekend? Lois and I are bicycles in forest trails on Lake County. Well, there's a lot of content conveyed there. We know exactly what the person is doing this weekend. That is a 2. What about dinner? What kind of food should we have? The chicken is grill at our dinner today. Okay, we have some content that's meaningful, but there's a tense issue that adds some confusion. That would receive a score of 1. The response is in the incorrect tense for that prompt, marked by is and today. Perhaps there was a comprehension breakdown over dinner plans, and clarification would need to occur. When should we go? As Jana, working by 6 p.m. Again, we have some content, some meaningful content that's conveyed back, but is it completely clear? We might need another turn to clarify, so that receives a score of 1. I'm excited to see you. Me and the number 2, that abbreviation that we sometimes see in text that is still meaningful, replacing a number for the word to, and that would receive a score of 2. Anything else going on? Go church for Sunday. Well, we see the difficulty with grammar there, but still quite meaningful. So that receives a score of 2. Tell me more about that. New pastor, heart emoji. Very meaningful. They like the new pastor. And that response is very communicative in relation to the prompt. It has to do with church, and that receives a score of 2. And that concludes the training on the Texta rating scale. Please refer to the administration and scoring protocol for more tips on administration, scoring, and the kinds of observations you want to make during administration. Thank you so much for your interest in this measure.